1808, on the Mississippi River above the Des Moines Rapids, a United States military detachment built the first structure in what would become Iowa, a stockade of timber cabins and wooden pikes. It became known as Fort Madison. 31 years later, in 1839, a few hundred feet away, the new frontier government built a new structure of limestone and iron, the Iowa Territorial Prison, or as it later became known, the Fort. 176 years later, the prison, antiquated, dilapidated, and crumbling, was retired. On August 1st, 2015, the 506 inmates of the prison were moved to the new Iowa State Penitentiary, just 1 mile to the north. At dawn, the inmates are awakened. The cells are searched. They pack up their belongings, and they bid farewell to their homes of 10, 20, even 30 years or more. Among them, the senior-most inmate at the prison, the longest-serving inmate in Iowa, and one of the longest-serving in the United States and the world, Jack Nutter.
What year did you come here, Jack?
56.
So you've been here 60 years. You've got seniority here, is that right?
Yeah, everybody.
He's got everybody beat. Long time. You've probably learned a thing or two while you're here.
Well, not really.
In the prison cafeteria, the inmates change into jumpsuits and are shackled with leg chains. They then walk out of their cell blocks for the last time.
How's it feel to be leaving here today?
I got mixed emotions. I've been here so long, but I'm glad to get it over with. You know, you get all the anticipation and waiting, and I'm glad to get it over with. Feel good to get this fresh air. Yeah.
They cross the prison yard and pass the oldest prison building of all, Old Cell House 17. It was there, almost exactly 176 years earlier, that the first prisoner arrived at what was then called the Iowa Territorial Prison.
What's up, big fella?
Oh, all right.
Heading on back?
Yes, sir.
Another day, another dollar?
Another day, another dollar.
When I arrived and was making rounds throughout the institution, and in the process of making rounds, I realized we had a significant number of offenders, lifers who'd been here many, many years, 30, 40 years, and one individual 50 plus. And I'd ask, have you ever put your name in for transfer? Well, yeah, what are you doing in a max joint? Perfect on paper. When I say perfect on paper, nothing negative in their classification, not catching disciplinary reports. And they said, we like it here. I've never heard that in a maximum security institution. I've never heard an individual say that he did not want to leave at the earliest opportunity.
If some inmates wanted to stay at the fort, there was a time when no prisoner would be caught dead there. What was life like at the Iowa Territorial Prison during its harsh early years? We know, thanks largely to University of Iowa criminology professor Fred Haynes in his landmark work, The Iowa Prison System.
Of all the state institutions in Iowa, the first to be established was a penitentiary. Work began in July 1839, and the first prisoner was received on September 22, 1839. 12 convicts were sent to the institution before adequate facilities were provided, and 7 of them escaped. At another time, 3 prisoners escaped while the guard was at supper. Afterwards, the more dangerous convicts were required to wear the necklace, an iron collar with 2 iron horns extending beyond the shoulders. 6 prisoners in November 1840 were described as well secured with a ball and chain. Professor Fred Haynes, State University of Iowa, the Iowa Prison System.
In the early days, the wardens of the Iowa State Penitentiary believed not just in hardware like balls and chains, but hard living conditions and harder punishments, including whipping so brutal that in one case, a prisoner died from his wounds. But no amount of punishment could stem the tide of new prisoners. By 1860, the old cell house, 2 stories tall with 108 cells, was overflowing. At the turn of the 20th century, 3 new cell houses, 18, 19, and 20, were added. Prisoners were tasked to build not only the cell houses, but the 30-foot walls that would imprison them. Stones were hauled from Illinois across the frozen Mississippi River, and later from nearby Anamosa. Inmate masons piled stones one on top of the other, securing them with mortar brought by armies of inmates marching 2 by 2, hauling buckets of cement under the watchful eye of prison guards. Some prisoners died when the hills they were excavating collapsed, the rocks crushing them to death. The prison's physical changes reflected the growth of the prison population. In 1860, there were 99 prisoners, ranging from 16 to 68 years old. Only 22% were serving sentences longer than 5 years. 4% had life sentences. 9% 10-year sentences, and another 9% sentences over 5 years. The vast majority, 77%, had sentences of 4 years or less. In the coming century, the fort would not physically change much, but the prisoner population and the sentences they served would change dramatically.
Shortly after arriving, because I saw a group of guys standing in a certain area of the yard. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were standing on their toes because one area of the yard, if you strain high enough, you can catch a glimpse of that river. They have no view of the horizon, with the exception of that one spot.
I don't miss that wall. You know, I hated that wall personally. Every time I look up at that wall, it reminded me that I was incarcerated. You know, and I looked at it for 30-something years, you know, and, you know, it was never anything good about that wall.
The inmates continue the move to the new penitentiary. they walk out of the fort's main gate for the last time, headed for armored transport buses. The buses head towards famous U.S. Highway 61, passing the fort's west wall. These walls defined the inmates' world for 176 years, for good and bad, for years, decades, lifetimes. Offenders could rarely see trees, houses, or people outside the prison. Just the 30-foot walls and the sky above. But the walls didn't define bleak limits alone. They defined other things. For members of the prison's Bulldogs football team, the walls were the field's sidelines. The guard towers atop the walls, serving as the fort's version of a stadium luxury box. For one Fort Madison inmate, the walls provided contours of a world record-breaking challenge. In 1960, inmate Robert Poindexter became the first man incarcerated inside a prison to break the 4-minute mile while sprinting along the 10-acre perimeter of the fort's walls, earning him worldwide fame, even coverage in Sports Illustrated. For the members of the prison's Chiefs baseball team, the wall defined the outfield, serving as the fort's answer to Fenway Park's famous Green Monster.
I played on the Chiefs, I played on the Saints, the softball team. We played softball on Saturdays and baseball on Sundays for the outside teams coming in. I was playing left field, and the outside team had a pitcher who only had one arm. He had one arm missing. And he hit 2 balls out to me, just cans of corn, and I missed both of them. We know where the ball diamond's at now. Well, it used to be way down at the other corner where Tower 13's at. And they brought people in from outside that was hitting balls through the windows of the industry building. We had more hours in the yard then, and we only got 2 hours now. Out there you could play a whole ball game. Now they're playing one pitch. I never heard of it.
Select inmates were allowed to work outside the fort's walls, including on nearby prison farms. The senior-most lifer inmates, or trusties, were even allowed to fish for their supper on the Mississippi River. One of the most coveted jobs outside and inside the prison walls, tending to the flowers adorning the entrance of the penitentiary.
This used to look like a campus on the inside. In the summertime, it had beautiful flower gardens, and it was all groomed. All out front administration buildings over by the cell houses had beautiful flower gardens. And I have old pictures to show the beauty and the flowers. And we took pride in that.
The warden of the Iowa State Penitentiary is Percy Laneson. Warden Laneson is here with me tonight, and I'd like for you to meet him, and let's ask him some questions. Mr. Laneson, it seems to me that these prisoners are pretty well treated over there. I was under the impression that men were sent to prison for punishment.
No, men are not sent to prison for punishment. They're sent to prison as punishment.
You mean just their very presence there is all the punishment that's required?
About all the punishment that you can give any man is to deprive him of his liberty and his freedom. And they probably understand that better than anybody else in the world.
Well, what are you able to...
Historically, prisons were built and no one cared what happened inside as long as the individuals who had committed crimes were kept inside. One of the biggest things that happened is there was a realization that the sentence was the punishment, not prison. That's indicated, when you look at sentences of old where it said 40-year sentence of solitary confinement and hard labor. Another evolution was the need to communicate, two-way communication, not just barking orders at someone. The evolution whereby prisoners and offenders were actually allowed to talk, as opposed to the old days of penitence, silence, solitary confinement. When you come out of your cell, you stand at attention and turn right when we tell you to, and walk in a lockstep with your arm affixed to the shoulder of the individual in front of you. The word compassion doesn't come into play normally when people talk about a warden, and in reality, it's one of the best tools you can have in your arsenal. It's one of the most critical and vital tools for any warden to have, and that would be compassion for the people that you're responsible for, which includes your staff and offenders.
If the fort in the 1800s embodied the frontier prison for much of the 20th century, the Iowa State Penitentiary was one of the most progressive, forward-thinking prisons in America. From 1910 until the 1960s, several Iowa State Penitentiary wardens, among them J.C. Sanders, Percy Laneson, Glenn Haynes, and John Bennett, instituted some of the most cutting-edge prison reforms in the United States. Inmate music programs, marching bands, a dinner orchestra, music review programs, even a prison band, the Madisonians, who had a weekly radio show carried throughout the state of Iowa. Sports programs, including the Chiefs baseball and Saints softball teams, which were racially integrated decades before Major League Baseball, to the semi-pro Bulldog football team, a squad that went undefeated and captured the state championship in 1931. Inmate education programs, from prisoner Chautauquas in the 1900s to auto mechanics classes sponsored by the Ford Motor Company in the 1950s and 60s. Psychological and substance abuse programs, decades ahead of their times, including group therapy for prisoners, one of the first ever chapters of Alcoholics Anonymous inside a prison, and a partnership with the University of Iowa. In the 1950s, Warden Percy Laneson even allowed inmates to own cameras and take pictures throughout the prison, believing it would promote transparency. One inmate, Robert Neese, even published the acclaimed Prison Exposures, a book billed as the first photographs of life inside a prison by a convict. The photos were of such extraordinary quality, they were featured in the pages of Life magazine. Neese focused on extraordinary topics, including inmate-on-inmate violence, mental illness, even homosexuality and gay marriage among inmates. In 1953, Warden Laneson went one step further, opening the prison to the cameras of television station WOI-TV, resulting in one of the first ever prison documentaries in America.
The Iowa State Penitentiary is 7 years older than the state itself. The first inmate entered here in July 1839, and the institution now houses approximately 1,270 inmates. Well, here's a cell block. This is an inside picture. You're looking at the many tiers of the cell. This is called a range. They go in their cells before dark and for a certain period of time are free to follow their own activities within the cell. They have headphones and they can listen to radios. After certain amounts of time in the cell and getting ready for this and that, they go out to eat. Now, the dining hall is near the center of the compound, and here we see the men filing out of their cells in a definite order. They're always in the same position with regard to their cellmates as they go into the dining hall and as they sit and eat. Here we see them filing in and sitting down. There's no talking here. They can have what they want extra by holding up their fingers and signaling.
When you went in a dining hall, you had signs for everything. There was bread, there's potatoes, water, coffee, beans, spaghetti, knife, fork, and spoon was for stew, milk. You could have seconds and everything but meat and dessert.
If inmates had to be silent in the dining hall, there was another place they had near total freedom of speech: the fort's prison magazine, the Presidio. The prisoners had substantial editorial freedom and used it, publishing controversial attacks on Iowa's parole system, among other targets. In fact, a Presidio editorial against Iowa's death penalty contributed to the biggest criminal justice reform in the history of the Hawkeye State. The death penalty was a feature of Iowa's justice system from the very beginning. In the 1800s, sheriffs were in charge of executions, staging them in their local counties. But starting in 1894, all executions were moved to a central location, the Iowa State Penitentiary. Over the next 70 years, 29 men were hanged at the fort. Professor Dick Hawes described the process in his book, Iowa and the Death Penalty, A Troubled Relationship.
About 30 minutes before the execution, the condemned would dress in suit and tie, bid farewell to any last visitors, and walk to the nearby gallows, a platform built about 8 feet off the ground with a wooden arm overhanging it, a trap door beneath the arm. The condemned man would be positioned over the trap door. His legs would be bound together with a leather belt. His arms would be pinned to his sides with another belt. The black hood would be fitted over his head. The noose would be adjusted around his neck, its knot behind his ear. One of the prison officials would signal all was ready.
Ready!
The sheriff would pull the lever.
Jack Nutter was nearly one of the last inmates hung at Iowa State Penitentiary. Arrested for murdering a police officer during a cross-country joyride, Nutter's publicly appointed defense attorney told him to plead guilty. The lawyer said the plea would get the lesser sentence of life in prison and spare him the noose. So Nutter pled guilty. But despite his lawyer's assurances and his plea, the judge sentenced Nutter to hang. The year was 1956. Nutter was 18. And so Nutter took up residence in Cell 4 of the fort's death row. He took his case to the Iowa Supreme Court. The court rejected his appeal. It looked like Jack Nutter would hang. Then came April 8th, 1957.
I was listening on the radio. We had plug in with earphones, and the commentator said that the governor commuted my sentence from death to life, but I wouldn't hear about it until the next day when I read it in the paper. And I hollered a little bit and jumped up and down. The officer out there was hollering at me, "Jack, did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And I said, "Yeah." So I felt pretty good.
While Nutter's appeal was pending, the prisoner magazine The Presidio published an extraordinary editorial against the death penalty, featuring photos of the fort's actual gallows, entitled "The Last Mile."
This is the last mile for the man convicted of a capital crime and about to pay with his life. 18 steps lead to the gallows and to the death of a human being. 15 of those steps are wood. 3 steps were built of man's life and habits. The final step is the law that decrees that man must kill man, and eye for an eye. The law itself tries to teach others the value of life by casually destroying life, thus thwarting its avowed purpose.
The Last Mile was widely republished throughout Iowa and helped fuel the state's anti-death penalty movement. 9 years later, that movement succeeded. In 1965, Iowa abolished capital punishment, the 8th state in the United States to do so, joining Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and 4 others.
When I came here, this was the penitentiary. The guard didn't even break up a fight. They would just stand there like we stand there and watch the fight, begging them to stop. Hey, come on, man, that's enough. Then after the fight was over, whoever was hurt would go to the hospital. Now they run and break the fight up, spray the mace and all that. But back then, they didn't do that because they know that the rest of the prisoners wasn't going to allow that.
Back then, when I first come in, we could govern them ourselves. If somebody was screwing up, we would just take him off the corner and talk to him, and it would straighten up. Now, if you take somebody off to the corner, you're going to go to lockup because they'll tell on you. Back then, if they told on you, that you go talk to the shift captain or something, tell him what was going on, and he'll say, "Well, okay, well, we'll let it go." But we can't do nothing now.
In the 1970s, there were signs of trouble at the fort. The inmate population at the fort swelled. The prison overcrowded. Inmate gangs flourished. Over the years, the prison yard became so dangerous, offenders began calling it the jungle. Then, on September 2nd, 1981, all hell broke loose.
It began with a staff hostage taking in the dining hall. The security director, the 2 assistant security directors, and the lieutenant had been taken hostage by inmates. That they were armed not only with shanks homemade knives, but also with pipe shotguns. From there, the disturbance escalated when another group of trainee correctional officers were taken hostage.
Among the hostages taken was Rich Barlow. It was his 4th day on the job.
They came to the window of the training office, and we'd locked the door, and because we didn't know what was going on. And they knocked on the window and said, "We want to come in." I said, "Well, we're not going to let you in." I was scared to death. Scared to death. We didn't know what was going on. They finally got in, and they corralled all of us. What they did, they made us remove our shirts. They used those for blindfolds, and our belts. They tied us up, hands behind our back with the belts. No one to help us. No way to get in or out. So yeah, we were terrified.
Major portions of the institution on the inside was set on fire.
Water sprinklers were going off, and the smoke, you could just smell it everywhere. One of the guys was holding us hostage, had a radio, and they were doing some negotiation back and forth. And at that time, he didn't think they were giving him any consideration, so he threatened to cut our fingers off to prove his point.
A helicopter had been set up to just hover over the institution with the large lights on. Several of the inmates had been in Vietnam, and they thought it was a gunship. And they immediately surrendered, lay flat on the ground, and that kind of stopped the riot at that point. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, the institution was retaken when correctional staff, officers from the Iowa State Patrol, and some other state law enforcement agencies went inside the institution and were able to secure it.
When dawn broke on September 3rd, fires still smoldered. One inmate was dead, killed by other prisoners, and $1 million worth of damage had been done to the fort. The response was swift. A new warden, Crispus Nix, was brought in from the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to bring order to the fort. Nix implemented strict discipline, adding a new elite enforcement unit to the corrections staff, the Correctional Emergency Response Team, or CERT. At the fort, a new era had begun.
Right after the other, the two of them go into a holding pattern at some point, and until they transport one. And these guys, it will be an expedited move because they will get their own very personal ride, if you will.
My name is Captain Doug Bolton. I'm the Certain Canine Commander. I've worked here at the Iowa State Penitentiary since October of 1992. After the riot in 1981, Warden Crispus Nix assumed command and responsibility of the Iowa State Penitentiary. And he was a retired Army officer. And with that, he brought the concept of the Correctional Emergency Response Team here at the Iowa State Penitentiary.
Third directive, back up so my team can cuff you. Well, you're going to have to come in. Open it. Do this. Get your hand up there.
It has evolved over the years, but there are still some basic guiding principles that remain today. High-risk offender escorts, the checking of the bars, which is critical to the safekeeping of our perimeter. Use of force is our last parameter or our last stop. We most definitely try to de-escalate at all costs. That's the ultimate objective. If you can communicate and learn de-escalation, it's safer for you, it's safer for everybody, it's safer for the offender because then you don't have to use force.
Right here. This old cell right here. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much, yeah. Had a spring bed here and got the two shelves up there. Usually we have a table right there, so you have a table. Usually people had a table right there, so that was about it. Had the two lights, and that was it. Yeah. That's what everybody stayed in. They condemned it. A lot of years. It's old cell house.
Before the 1981 riot, the inmates of the Iowa State Penitentiary filed an extraordinary class action lawsuit. They claimed conditions at the fort violated the Constitution's Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment. On one issue, the federal courts agreed. Cell House 17 was in such bad condition, it was an unlawful danger to the inmates' safety. Old Cell House 17, the original Iowa Territorial Prison building, the first state building in Iowa, was ordered closed. Some argued the entire prison should be closed, but it would soldier on until the next crisis. On November 14, 2005, at 7:01 p.m., a correctional officer noticed something unusual by the west wall. A makeshift rope made from burlap, tied to a homemade hook, hanging from the roofline of the maintenance shop. An alarm was sounded. An emergency count was conducted. 2 inmates were missing. Soon, guards made another discovery on Building 297, the former death row building. There they found another burlap rope, tied off to the roof on one end and to a grappling hook on the other, secured like a zip line to the top of the fort's west wall. Inmates Robert Lejeune and Martin Moon had managed perhaps the most daring escape in the history of the fort, using homemade equipment, allowing them to scale and rappel down the fort's walls. But if their escape from the prison showed ingenuity, their flight from Fort Madison did not. Moon was captured on November 17. He was found in a stolen car on a side road outside Chester, Illinois, where he had pulled over to sleep. He failed to notice the road was a service entrance to an Illinois state prison. Lejeune was captured November 18th in Steele, Missouri, in a stolen pickup at a truck stop where he bought gas and a sandwich. The cashier asked him where he was from. Lejeune's response made her suspicious. He said he was a state convict. The facts of their capture might have been laughable, but the consequences of their escape were profound. In 2008, plans were announced to build a new Iowa State Penitentiary and close the fort for good. Three surveillance airplanes watch from the sky as the armored buses arrive at the new maximum security Iowa State Penitentiary. The new prison has state-of-the-art design and electronics. From its pod design to over 350 security cameras throughout the facility. The one thing missing, the fort's old 30-foot walls, replaced by a multi-tiered state-of-the-art security fence.
Update is it's approximately 12:15 in lunch hour, and we've moved just under 600 offenders in about 6.5 hours. It's with minimal incidents as far as zero use of forces at this point. just minimal special rides for a few. And the staff of all the different supporting agencies, the staff within the Iowa Department of Corrections and the Iowa State Penitentiary have performed in an admirable manner. And I couldn't be prouder of everybody that's been here and been a part of this morning. And we've moved the most problematic offenders in the state of Iowa approximately 1.2 miles without any incident. It's a tremendous testament to the staff of the Iowa Department of Corrections and all the other supporting agency that's local law enforcement around here of what can be done in prior planning and putting things to execution.
Tell us where we're going now.
This is D-Pod of our top-tiered offenders, the best behaved offenders that we have.
Looking around the facility, to our far left we've got Housing Unit 3. This is the double bunked area, highest privilege level of the offenders in this camp.
You can see the physical plant configuration. The way it slopes in at the end gives the officer much more visibility as opposed to a square where you can't see the cell front. This allows the officer to see every cell front. That's very beneficial.
Straight in front of us is Housing Unit 1. This is where our problematic offenders end up. This is our restrictive housing. So these are the guys that haven't quite learned how to control their behavior in a general population setting.
Hold on a minute. Kawasaki, how come your pants aren't hooked up? I'm trying to do it right now. You're always trying to do it. You got to tighten it up.
We've got the activities building, which has religious services, educational opportunities, as well as indoor and outdoor recreation.
We're on the recreation yard. We have a brand new softball field, very, very popular for the offenders to play softball, and occasionally we'll have a offender versus staff game.
We're surrounded by a double fence with electronic stun fence on the interior and the top of the exterior. Multiple cameras throughout the open areas of the institution, in addition to all the enclosed cameras in the buildings.
The fence you see immediately to my left is a out of bounds area. On the other side, you'll see the double fence. The double fence replaces the large walls that we had at the other institution. Fence that has electronic intrusion devices in it. It has a non-lethal stun fence. The stun fence is designed to shock you and throw you away from the fence.
I tell you, I like it. I like it because I've looked at a gray wall around the prison for about 33 years. The old forts, it was just like an old fortress to me. And I didn't realize how much I'd appreciate this till I got up here, and you can look through the fence. You can see some cars moving. You can see some birds, some different type of birds. It's amazing after looking at a wall for 33 years straight.
Someone had just said to me last week that they didn't like the fence because they can see that freedom out there. When versus having the wall, they wasn't able to see that. Now I'm the opposite. I like seeing more. Like we can go to different places, you can see the cars going down the highway more. But that's me. But other people don't like the fence because they perceive it more as seeing that freedom, and it makes them feel that they want it more.
The thing I don't like is when I see the cars driving past through because it's a highway, and that make me, really sad. When I see a car or the sound of the car, it's like I remember when the free world. When I see like the free world, or the sun, or the wind, or the birds, I say, man, that this is true. That they're living in this place. They're gonna die here.
I know lifers used to have a chance of getting out of here. Now they can't. Now they don't. So I think when I came in, I think the maximum time a lifer did was 26 years. Now you got people doing 30 and 40s, 50s and 60s. I think there ought to be some kind of something done about that. Yeah, I don't.
I got a life sentence. Yeah, but I had 31 years straight. And I had a dime when I first came here in 1980. I had a dime, and I did 16 months. And there was one guy in the cell, a couple cells from me, he said, man, they were talking, and he said he had been down 5 years. In my cell, I'm thinking, 5 years? God dang. I said, that's a long time to be locked up, man. Now I got 31. I can imagine 5 wasn't nothing.
You can't buy freedom. You cannot buy freedom. Like I said, in the state of Iowa, the state means what they says when they give you a life sentence. They mean they want every bit of blood they can get. If judges come spend 6 months behind these bars, behind these walls, before they go and sit on that bench, they would think twice about how much time they give a person. Live in a room the size of his bathroom. So when you stretch your arms, wall to wall, you know, they would think, you know, the law is the law, but sometimes you just have to think about, is this right or is this wrong? That's what I would like to see, some judges to see from my point of view.
There are a lot of people who rather be at the old place. No more than about 45 minutes ago, guy said, man, I miss the old place. I miss that dingy, stony, walled place. You know, if you're in a place for a long number of years, you get used to it.
I'd rather be back down there now.
You would rather be back down there now?
Oh, yeah. Well, I grew up down there. Well, that's it. I grew up, and this isn't an old person prison. You can't, you gotta walk too far. Like I've been trying to get a Segway so I can get around.
The biggest thing that stands out is character. Tiny, secure, historical. You don't see classy old ladies like the fort everywhere. That place enveloped you. Walking through alone, it doesn't feel like you're the only person walking around that institution.
When I think about the fort, the old institution, the first things that come to mind are Cell House Row, and just the sights, sounds, and smells of it when it was a living institution. I can still go back in there and I can see the architecture, but it's different. Our staff and some of our offenders, Mr. Nutter's one of them, that every time I see him he volunteers to go back and be the housekeeper down there. He swears nothing bad will happen if we just let him go back to his home.
They could have turned me loose 4 days after I was here, and I'd never got in trouble again. Now I'm too old to get in trouble.